Greetings and welcome to the third in a series of 4 webcasts OMB Watch is sponsoring on Obama at year 1. My name is Lee Mason. I'm the Director of Nonprofit Speech Issues here at OMB Watch. I will be today's moderator for this webcast on Obama administration's approach to lobbyists. I invite you to visit our website at www.ombwatch.org for the date of our final webcast on Recovery Act transparency, implementation, and effectiveness. Previous webcasts on transparency and regulatory reform are available at www.ombwatch.org/webcast archive. In the last national election, in the aftermath of the Jack Abramoff scandal, candidate Barack Obama promised to curb the influence of lobbyists and special interests. He noted that our government has been turned, and I quote, into a game only the lobbyists and special interests can afford to play. On January 21st, 2009, his first full day in office, President Obama began to follow through on his campaign promise. He issued Executive Order 13490, ethics commitments by executive branch personnel, which created new restrictions on former lobbyists appointed to the executive branch. In March of that year, the administration issued guidance that enacted a gift ban on lobbyists and restricted the kind of communications lobbyists could have about stimulus and TARP funds. The administration then announced via blog posts that it was the aspiration of the administration that federally registered lobbyists not be appointed to agency advisory boards and commissions. The administration also made White House visitor logs publicly accessible so that the public can see who is wielding influence. Now, enacting these measures were consistent with his campaign pledges. At the same time, some of his campaign promises may not have been acted upon. For example, he called for an end to the practice of writing legislation behind closed doors. He also promised a centralized, searchable website on ethics and lobbying information, which has not yet developed. Even some of the requirements of the ethics order have not been fully implemented. For example, the requirement to develop recommendations for improved disclosure of executive branch procurement lobbying has yet to be done. Today, we want to examine whether the Obama administration has curbed the influence of lobbyists and special interests, and whether they need to be curbed in the first place. A recent Congressional Research Service report concluded that restrictions on federally registered lobbyists' access to executive branch department and agencies has already changed the relationship between lobbyists and covered executive branch officials. Could this be true? According to the Center for Responsive Politics, in 2009, lobbyist clients spent more than $3.47 billion on such issues as healthcare reform, financial reform, and energy policy, up more than 5% over 2008, the previous all-time high for lobbying expenditures. Last year's fourth quarter also marked the first quarter in U.S. history that federal lobbying expenditures cracked the $900 million mark, hitting a record $955.1 million for the last quarter. This is also by the Center's research. Now, lobbying is a constitutional right, a right that should be cherished. By the same token, have things gone awry? The corruption of money in politics is a key concern for OMB Watch. At the same time, we're concerned that all lobbyists are being put in the same boat. For example, OMB Watch considers there a distinction between for-profit lobbyists and nonprofit lobbyists. Today, our panelists will address these issues. And I want to introduce Melanie Sloan, the Executive Director of Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, Rich Gold from the law firm of Holland and Knight, Dave Winhold, the President of the American League of Lobbyists, and Larry Ottinger, President of the Center for Lobbying in the Public Interest. They will each take 5 minutes to state their views, addressing three broad areas that we have listed here. Has the Obama administration been successful thus far in reducing lobbyist influence in decision-making? If so, is that a good thing? Related to the first question, has the focus on lobbyists actually reduced the influence of special interests in Washington? If so, how? If not, why not? Whether you believe the administration's efforts on lobbying and ethics to date have been successful, what else could be done to address special interest influence in Washington? We will then take questions from the audience and from our web viewers via email. Those of you participating via webcast can submit your questions to questions@ombwatch.org. The email address will scroll occasionally across the bottom of your screen. I will ask the audience in the room to refrain from applause or other forms of expression until the end of the session. And we'll now invite Melanie to start us off in this discussion.
Hi, thanks for having me, Lee. I appreciate the invitation. Well, I think that the answer to whether the Obama administration has been successful in reducing lobbyist influence was answered by Lee when he was talking about how much money's been spent on lobbying in 2009. Clearly not. Lobbyists are just as influential as ever, and while President Obama may have expressed some interest in reducing the impact of lobbyists, Congress clearly has not expressed that same interest and does not share that view. Lobbyists spend much more of their time on Capitol Hill than they do with the administration, and they're continuing to do so. And Congress continues to court lobbyists and particularly court their campaign dollars. So I don't think that we've seen any particular change. One thing that I think is worrisome is the president's rhetoric isn't meeting the reality. So I think Americans are going to be continually disappointed when they see that business in Washington hasn't changed, when the president says things like he did at the State of the Union, that they are changing the way business is done in Washington. So there will be a question of should people believe what they're seeing, what their own eyes are telling them, or what the president is telling them. And I think that's a pretty big disconnect. Wishing that business was changed, the way business was done in Washington was changed, doesn't make it so. And that's pretty much where the president is at this point, wishing it would be so. He's certainly taken some actions that he believes will diminish the impact of lobbyists. But again, I don't think that most of those choices actually did change anything. The main thing was early in his administration when he banned lobbyists from speaking with his administration about Stimulus Act, Recovery Act money, for example. And what that was really doing, in effect, was just turning other people into lobbyists. If you say the lobbyists can't come to town and can't come to talk to your administration, what you do is you turn the corporate boards and presidents of companies and other such people into de facto lobbyists. And sometimes what you had was lobbyists, in fact, driving these people to meetings with administration officials, telling them what to say, giving them the questions, giving them directions in the building, and then picking them up and getting a briefing from them, because these were folks who weren't used to dealing with the administration and didn't know really how to go about it. And in fact, Crew worked with the American League of Lobbyists, as well as the ACLU, to change that rule because it seemed like an unreasonable one to us. Crew is in favor of more disclosure instead of banning anybody from speaking with the administration. We think a much better tactic would be for all meetings to be on the record. Let's have disclosure of not just meetings with lobbyists, but meetings with the corporate vice presidents. In fact, given that some of the administration had banned campaign donations by lobbyists during the campaign, but they hadn't banned, say, the donations by members, people who were executives in corporations, those people might in fact be viewed as more influential than their lobbyists. And clearly when the president of a major bank contacts the administration, that person's going to have way more influence than their lobbyist ever would. So I think the answer is clearly the influence hasn't changed. I know that the president is trying again with this banning lobbyists from corporate board, from these the trade advisory boards, I think of them as ITACs, and it's a question about what that will mean, how effective that will be, who will be those replacements on those boards, and we don't know the answer yet. You know, if you've, again, taken John Deere's lobbyist off, but you've put somebody else from John Deere on the board, have you really made a difference? I'd query, and I would say probably not. The thing that I think would really make a difference in Washington, because all of this talk about lobbyists is really tinkering around the edges, is campaign finance reform. Until we break the link between the money and legislation, or at least the perceived link between the two, although I would argue, of course, that it's much more than just a perception, you will always have people doubting that we're getting legislation based on the American people's best interests. It will always appear that it is based on politicians' need to increase their campaign coffers. So I'll pass on from there.
I want to invite our online viewers to submit your comments at questions@ombwatch.org.
Thanks very much. Rich Gold with Honda Knight. Thank you all for having me here today, and Lee especially in OMB Watch. My name is Rich Gold, and I am a lobbyist.
It's okay.
I was hoping they would all say, "Hi, Rich," and an unabashed lobbyist. And my low point this year has been I got into my office one morning, only a few weeks ago, right before Christmas, and found a little pink note in my satchel from my 11th grade daughter, who said, you know, "Daddy, go do good things today. I know you're a good lobbyist, and not those people the president is talking about." At which point I started to get a little disheartened. To get to the questions at hand, though, I don't think the Obama administration's efforts have been effective so far, but following up on what Melanie said, and I agree with and incorporate by reference much of what she said, I don't think it's possible to go at it the way the president and his staff are going at this and actually have an impact. And we can talk a little bit about campaign finance as well. I'm sure David's going to agree with me that if you ban all of us from giving, you know, a single dollar for the rest of our lives as lobbyists, we would welcome that. But there's also the little problem of the Constitution and what the court will uphold, as we've seen recently. I do think greater transparency, both on the contact side as well as on the campaign finance side, would help here and makes a lot of sense. There's absolutely no reason in today's day and age, when you make a contribution to a member of Congress, whether it be an individual, a lobbyist, whoever it is, that campaign contribution can't be up on the web within 24 hours and be searchable easily on a centralized database. And for that matter, at the same time, when you have a contact with a member of Congress or whatever, that there be you know, some kind of transparency there. The issue with all this is balancing the disclosure with the burden on free speech, and that's a balance that needs to be cut in a way without the president giving out dictates on, here's what I thought, and it's really his staff at this point, and I won't mention the particular gentleman at issue. Here's what I thought of that would be a great idea now that I want to go do. There needs to be much more discussion and consensus building around this issue, much as we're talking about issues like healthcare and energy and climate right now. If one side tries to ram something down the throat of the other side and the American people, we will get nowhere on this issue, as we are getting nowhere on those issues. And so, you know, what I would suggest, and what I've suggested in my writings so far, have been pulling together some kind of consensus-based stakeholder process to come up with suggestions that everybody can agree to and work on. Because, as Melanie referred to, if we wait for Congress on their own to act on this issue, we'll be, well, my daughter will be lobbying on that issue, you know, when she's a lobbyist. So I think that some kind of process in that realm is the right path forward. I don't think the impact of special interests has been reduced to date, nor do I think it's going to be reduced going forward with any of the new initiatives that have been proposed by the administration. And I do have to stand up for two things here. One, what lobbyists do on a daily basis, which I'm sure David will perfect after I finish here, is to provide information based on one point of view, their client's point of view, in terms of what action either Congress or an executive branch agency should take on a particular issue. And that's what we view ourselves as educators. There are certainly elements of the lobbying community, just as there are elements of the nonprofit community. I will remind everybody here that step out of line from time to time, do things with money they shouldn't do things with access they shouldn't do. But there is a tool to deal with those things, and the tool is called prosecution and jail time. And that seems to be working relatively well so far. In fact, if you want to cut right now the interests of special interests in a very effective way, we could actually have the Justice Department start enforcing the law, because they're not doing it right now. There are thousands of referrals annually under the Lobbying Disclosure Act that go over to the Department of Justice, and no cases are ever brought. So if this administration wants to get serious on cracking down on things, and I have integrity and I'm an honest lobbyist, but this is clearly a statement against interest, we ought to have an enforcement initiative that goes out there and enforces the laws on the books. Let's see how that works before we start creating more barriers to free speech. With that, I think I'll pass on. I think it's 5 minutes, but I've got lots of other juicy ideas we can talk about in the comment period.
Excellent. My name is Dave Winhold. I'm the president of the American League of Lobbyists. So you might have noticed I left my horns and tail at home.
But they're on your cufflinks.
They are on my cufflinks. Yeah, I wore those. I got the heaven and the hell on both cufflinks just to remind me where I am. One of the things that I think, Rich alluded to was that most people have no clue what a lobbyist really does. A lobbyist educates and informs. Our job is to go up there and tell a side of a story. And quite frankly, if you ever deviate from that story or lie to our legislator, you're not welcome back. So it doesn't do us any good to lie to anybody. The rhetoric that Melanie was talking about does not meet reality. The Obama administration came out and said, no lobbyists in my administration. And then you grant a waiver. And then you grant another waiver. The second you grant a waiver, you lose credibility. Because what you've done is you've said, some lobbyists are good, but we're going to make the decision on what lobbyists are good and what aren't. And this goes to Lee's point of for-profit versus non-profit lobbyists. I don't think there is a distinction. At that point in time, you're making justification on who deserves to have a voice. It's got to be all or nothing, as Rahm Emanuel said. I thought he hit it right on the head there. As Melanie also alluded to, during the Recovery Act stimulus process, we went over and met with the administration, which is something that I wish the administration had actually come to us beforehand. And if in this town, I've never heard of when you're going to regulate somebody that you don't ask that body that you're going to regulate to the table for a conversation first. But it seems that the administration feels that the lobbying community is not welcome at the table, and we'll make the decision and we'll inform you on how that goes. It didn't turn out, when we went over there, we suggested that all communications be put up on the website, because disclosure is a good thing and transparency is a good thing. But we came to find out that wasn't really what the ban was about. The ban was an anti-lobbying ban, because it would have been very easy to put all contacts up on the website, just as easy as it is to put up the lobbying contacts. And the CEO of Walmart, or you name the big company, should be put up on the website just as much as any, Rich or myself going to the White House or one of the agencies. If you look at the White House, they've really kind of taken a hard stand on it and said, well, we've reduced the lobbying influence. Somebody in the White House, which I won't name either, came out and said, yes, we've reduced the influence of lobbyists here in Washington. Well, it's $3.47 billion later, 2,000 terminations later, and I don't think those 2,000 people that terminated have gone back to Arkansas and become farmers. What the administration has done through their policies is they've driven transparency into the ground and underground. And that's a bigger concern for the American League of Lobbyists, because I honestly believe that if it walks like a duck and talks like a duck, it needs to be registered as a duck.
Well, and fewer people paying dues.
Well, that too, but yeah. But transparency is a very good thing. I think too much sunlight, you know, I hear this all the time, well, sunlight is the ultimate disinfectant. Well, it also causes cancer. So you got to be careful you don't have, you know, a bright spotlight on one area. It should be all across the board. You know, recently Pew Research came out with a study that basically said lobbying reform rates 19th out of 21 issues that we should be focused on. 19th out of 21. Yet the State of the Union, the president came out and mentioned lobbyists 7 times. It may not seem like a lot, but he only mentioned Iraq 5 times, Afghanistan 5 times, and healthcare only 7 times. So we got to stop pushing the buck off on the lobbyist. It's the lobbyist's fault that nothing's getting done in Washington. We have to remember that lobbyists don't vote, ever. I think we need to get to the heart of it, which is campaign finance reform. I agree with Rich. If I never had to go to a fundraiser again, I would be all for that. And I know a lot of firms here in Washington saying, you know what, we can't, constitutionally, you you can't take somebody's opportunity to go to a campaign away from them. But maybe, one of my goals would be that the House and Senate come up with standing rules that they don't ask lobbyists. Plain and simple. That would be great, a great rule. And I'll end with this, but with the executive order that said you can't be a lobbyist in my administration if you served under your subject matter expertise, which left a lot of people on the sidelines that could contribute, you would think that a new administration coming in talking about change, you would want the best and the brightest on your team. That's what you'd think. And with the ITEX, what's happening, the trade, I'm sorry, Melanie, I agree, I keep thinking that too, the trade advisory committee boards, what you're doing is you're removing people with not only security clearances, but also years of experience in that area. And what are you replacing them with? Or is this a strategy to minimize and marginalize those trade committees so you can create policy that you choose? That's an option too that they may be looking at. The bottom line is that lobbyists disclose more than anybody else, pretty much in the United States. We disclose how much we make, who pays us, what issues we're lobbying on. I'm a 46 long in case anybody's interested. And I think that's what we're going to get down to. So I'm all for transparency. I think there's, some of the proposals out there are a little too much and without Congress acting as well, I think they're unenforceable, therefore pointless. So I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Dave. Well, thank you. First, I want to thank Lee and Amanda and Latifa and the rest of the staff at OMB Watch for putting together the series of webcasts, including the one today. And for those who don't know, our organization, the Center for Lobbying in the Public Interest, is very fortunate because our OMB Watch's Executive Director, Gary Bass, happens to be our Vice Chair as well. And he's a great nonprofit leader and mentor to me and many others in the sector. So I just want to thank all of you and to thank the rest of the panelists too for being here. I think this is, I don't think there's any more important subject than how our democracy works and making it work better and increasing the public's trust and confidence in government. Because I think at the bottom, that's, I believe, what the president was trying to do. Quickly, I just wanted to tell you, for those who don't know Center for Lobbying in the Public Interest, our nickname is Clippy, and we were founded more than 10 years ago with the sole mission of promoting, supporting, and protecting nonprofit advocacy and lobbying in order to strengthen participation in our democratic society and advance the missions of 501c3 charitable organizations. We come from a sector approach, having been founded in 1998 as a project of independent sector, and we bring that nonpartisan sector approach with a primary focus on social and human services charities that deal with the everyday issues that are so important to the public, from child welfare to affordable housing, education, and health for those who need it most, as well as the arts and what is sometimes referred to as civil society. I want to talk to you a little bit as a representative of charities here of a different approach to the problems we're talking about. Because on the one hand, I believe the concerns that the president was trying to address, as well as Senator John McCain during the last presidential campaign, when they both were scapegoating lobbyists, really had to do with public trust in democracy, engagement in democracy, people's feeling that they really were, the government is not something separate and apart from them, but that government really is of the people and that they have a voice in their government. So I want to present from the perspective of nonprofits who've had a history throughout our nation, from the voluntary associations that de Tocqueville praised when he came here, to today over more than 1 million charities providing an array of services and needs, that nonprofits have been the best vehicles for civic participation in our nation's history and have participated in helping, in bringing about fundamental social progress and in strengthening our democracy, everything from the abolition of slavery to the enfranchisement of women and African Americans, and that's a great, great legacy that nonprofits have brought to our country. I want to talk about 3 reasons why I believe our nonprofits are so important in revitalizing and restoring faith in democracy. As I mentioned, throughout history, nonprofits have brought basically broad-based civic participation, and that's what democracy is about. Out of many, we learn and develop policies that we believe will further the common good. Secondly, there's no way for most nonprofits to accomplish their missions, whether it's affordable housing, look at the foreclosure issue, whether it's environmental issues, healthcare, you name it, education, without involving government and business. Because government has 2 major roles I'd like to mention. One is they provide resources that philanthropy and charities don't have, simply do not have the resources to solve certain problems. And they also set the ground rules for the market. So the market responds to the incentives and rules that we, the people, the government, decide upon. So where there is market failure, obviously that's where nonprofits also step in. Third, nonprofits have relevant expertise and on-the-ground experience in implementing and solving our most difficult social challenges. So if you're a policymaker, or you should be affirmatively reaching out to hear from folks who are on the ground working on these issues. So those are the 3 perspectives that we bring to looking at the lobbying issue and how it affects charities and other nonprofits and how it affects the democracy and the public good. So we got involved when the president promulgated the executive order on ethics his first day in office. We were concerned because we're trying to understand the purpose. We strongly support the purpose that the president set forth, which was to elevate the public interest over special interest as defined, and that he wanted to restore faith in democracy. Those are the right things. We felt the means that were being used, particularly the restrictions on public service by folks who may not have any financial conflict of interest, which we saw as the core of the ethics issue. Is there a financial or pecuniary conflict of interest? Does this person have such a conflict? And by using the Lobbying Disclosure Act, not for a disclosure purpose, but for the purpose of restricting service, the policy went awry, and has been tremendously both over-inclusive and under-inclusive. It's over-inclusive, particularly with respect to charities and other nonprofits who focus on issue advocacy for those who don't have a financial conflict of interest, aren't going to government seeking money, but are seeking to deal with human rights, for example, in Darfur. There isn't, that financial conflict does not exist. So it's overbroad in that sense. It's under-inclusive in the ways that Melanie talked about, in that the Lobbying Disclosure Act only covers folks who are doing direct lobbying, and so it doesn't cover the vast majority of corporate executives, public relations firms that work for large companies, and the lawyers who work for large companies, by and large, are not registered lobbyists. You may have your senior vice president for government relations and others who may be registered lobbyists, but you'll find that the vast majority of business executives, and the ones that been talked about from AIG to any other company that may have been discussed in the public debate, will not have been covered. And so using the LD8 for that purpose is flawed. So we looked at what the White House did in terms of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act that was discussed here, and I want to praise the White House for listening and for I believe they have solicited the opinions of folks from different sectors, from different groups, and I believe in the case of the Recovery Act, they listened, and that led to them modifying their policy. So instead of saying it's registered lobbyists who we're concerned about, with the Recovery Act we were talking about money, unlike the executive order on ethics, which applied to anyone who wanted to serve in the executive branch, or many people wanting to serve in the executive branch, not necessarily anything to do with money and politics. The Recovery Act was about money, and people looking for, applying for grants, for contracts. And so what the White House ended up doing was narrowing the scope of time and saying that anybody, whether you're a registered lobbyist, did not end up basing this on the status of being a registered lobbyist. It was based on anyone who is seeking money from the government. And I think that sets out the hope that the administration recognized that the LDA didn't work there. I'm not, naive to think that they're going to necessarily translate that right away, but I think, particularly in light of the Supreme Court decision, which no one has mentioned yet, in Citizens United versus FEC, we see a huge shift in the landscape, the political landscape. And we know that large businesses and wealthy individuals already have a dominant interest in and place in policy and politics, but now it's gone to another level where there is no longer any limits, according to the current Supreme Court, in terms of corporate and union independent expenditures are unlimited now. So I think this makes it more incumbent upon nonprofits and both to revisit some of the rules that relate to charitable involvement in lobbying and in nonpartisan voter engagement. I think it's a time to revisit some of those, both the rules and the culture that have held philanthropy and charities back far too much for far too long from having their voices heard in the policy and political arena. And I believe that that there are several sort of democracy reform efforts that we've talked about, from public financing of elections to universal voter registration, to having a strong and independent media. There are a whole range of factors that make democracy work better, and that are predicated on the idea of greater civic engagement. So let me make one on the Citizens United case. I wanted to mention because I think David Brooks gave some comments that I thought were very interesting about this. He said the political system is broken, and the court's decision will have a poisonous effect on the political environment, that large businesses will have more leverage to seek or protect even greater subsidies for themselves from the federal government, and to crush small business by erecting regulatory barriers to competition. And he went so far as to say that we need to be considering constitutional amendments to fix the system. So in closing, I do want to note that we are close to the birthday of President Abraham Lincoln. And in his famous Gettysburg Address in 1863, President Lincoln made probably one of the most eloquent speeches about the essence and enduring commitment of American democracy, which I think is important for our discussion. He talked about a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, and ended by saying, "We here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and the government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish from the earth." I believe it is now our time and our turn and our responsibility to carry the torch of democracy and restore public faith in government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Thank you.
Wow. I like your passion, Larry. I have a couple of questions, and then I'm going to open it up to the audience and to our viewing audience. To remind you to send your questions to questions@ombwatch.org. This is a segue because we've clearly identified that lobbyists aren't the problem. If lobbyists aren't the problem, what are some suggestions for getting to the core issue, which really is money and influence in our day-to-day politics now, and the way policies are made? And what can we do to shift the focus from federally registered lobbyists? What can we do to get the administration to shift their focus from federally registered lobbyists to what the core issue is, which is money in government? And I'll start with Dave. I think you alluded to some of that earlier.
Yeah, I think that campaign finance reform is a key. I personally, with the Citizens United decision, I think they probably got it constitutionally correct when it comes down to freedom of speech. But is it good for the country? I doubt that. I really do. And that may be more of my personal position than the position of ALL. But I think that the lobbying community operates within the guidelines that are out there for us and the rules and regulations. 99.9% of us are doing honorably and ethically. We're not Jack Abramoff. I mean, that's the one thing that, you ask anybody in this town if they knew that guy and they'd say no. I'm not sure if that's the truth.
Right.
But one of the things that you got to understand is I represent nonprofits. And I have the same problem when I go back with my 9-year-old. They're like, "Oh, your dad's a lobbyist." Well, what does that mean? I think we have to address the money issue. But yet there's no current system. I mean, you want to talk about public financing, that's great, but who's going to want to put another $1,000 in their tax base to cover that? We need to figure out some real things and stop the administration, if they want to work with the community and say, "Hey, look, these are the perceived problems that we have. How do we work together on this?" Instead of just issuing edicts through blogs.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I don't think somebody said along the way here that the system's kind of broken here at this point, and that's certainly the case. And while we haven't seen the administration change the impact of special interests, we also haven't seen the administration change the tone in Washington. It's just gotten worse. I'm not blaming the administration on that. I'm just saying that's where we are right now. For this issue to change, I agree that the financing system's the issue. We're not going to get public financing or anything pie in the sky like that. In fact, you can sort of view the message of the public right now in the polling data that Dave referenced as being less government is back in. Being a Democrat, I've never seen the public flip this quickly. If you looked at polling data before the election, 60% wanted more from government. And if you look at the polling data today, that's now under 40%. To flip that quickly in 14, 16 months, Democrats have really screwed the pooch. That's the only way, we have done a horrible job on message. And the public is absolutely convinced we are all about, a socialist takeover of the country. And you see that in focus group data, and you see it in polling data, and that's just where people are right now. I don't think that's what's going on, but we have failed to convey the proper message. So things like public financing plays into, an existing misperception that would just get twisted even worse in the real world out there outside the Beltway. That said, I do think there are elements of the right and the left that are very interested in doing something about this because they do see it as a fundamental threat to how we move forward, and they also see it as a potential opportunity to try and get past the dead-end policy-making space we're in right now, where there's just no agreement on major issues of the day. But for that to happen, that's not going to happen in the White House, and it's not going to happen on Capitol Hill. There has to be an external effort, almost a grassroots effort, to bring that together and make it happen and come up with something that can withstand court review and frankly can be pushed down from outside the Beltway, the throats of those inside the Beltway. I just don't think Washington is capable on its own of making this change. And the era of a McCain-Feingold type effort, sort of driven both inside and outside the Beltway, not that it obviously didn't withstand court scrutiny, but I don't think you could even get an effort like that through today. So I do think we need grassroots on this, really rising up and some kind of, outside the Beltway, sort of bipartisan, citizens-related effort to come up with a solution and make it move. I could see somebody like Pew or a convener like that trying to pull something together in a commission format. And maybe you could get Congress to go so far as they did on things like base closure to, authorize that kind of effort and lay it down to an up and down vote and make members vote on it that way. But, until we get those types of changes, I'm very antsy that we're going to be in this netherworld where we're not really able to make serious policy.
One more question here. The Lobbying Disclosure Act requires those who lobby at the federal level to register and disclose information about their lobbying and campaign bundling. Even though the law was amended roughly 3 years ago, are there further changes that are needed? Melanie?
I'd say there are probably a lot of changes that could be used. I think the bundling numbers could be lower so that it's smaller amounts of money should be listed by bundlers. I think also it shouldn't again be just focused on lobbyists. There may be other people who are bundling and who are also therefore having a great impact. I think probably we should decrease the lobbying registration threshold from 20% to a lower threshold. My own view is any threshold that doesn't include Tom Daschle is too high a threshold.
Great quote.
Because, it's pretty clear to most people that somebody like Tom Daschle is in fact lobbying, and instead he's in this ubiquitous Washington class of consultants, and what are they really doing? They're influencing policy. So I think that there are changes that we could make. I'd also like to see some legal changes that I think actually would be constitutional, although certainly after Citizens United, things are much more up in the air. At least one federal court in North Carolina has upheld a ban on lobbyists making campaign contributions with the concept, and this was at the state level, lobbyists couldn't make campaign contributions. So if lobbyists couldn't make campaign contributions to the people they were lobbying, then I think it might withstand constitutional scrutiny because they have a choice. You can either make a campaign contribution or lobby a person, but not both. Similarly, I think we could say that contractors, anyone doing business with the government can't make campaign contributions, and certainly anyone seeking an earmark can't make a campaign contribution to someone from whom they're seeking that earmark. And I think all of these things might help break the link between money and legislative changes, or legislation and earmarks, and they would also go a long way to restoring public confidence that decisions were being made in the public interest and not just, again, in politicians' financial interest. And then the one other thing I'd like to say, and that I think is really important, is one of the things that I find so troubling about this demonization of lobbyists is that it doesn't put the responsibility for a lot of what's gone on where it clearly deserves to go, which is on members of Congress, particularly, as Dave alluded to. As Dave said, lobbyists aren't the ones who are voting in committee or voting on the floor. And any politician who is in fact bought and sold is responsible for being bought. And and what they're doing when they're blaming the lobbyists for all this is they're saying they can't help themselves. They cannot help but accept the trip or the expensive dinner, and they can't stop themselves from being seduced. And that makes them pretty irresponsible. And these are people as a class, by the way, who are always preaching personal responsibility for everybody else. So I find that troubling, but of course it behooves them to blame everybody else and move the target so people are focused on the evil lobbyists who are now looked on, below used car salesmen perhaps, rather than on politicians who also similarly are viewed very poorly, and yet they're refusing to take any responsibility. But I also will say lobbyists on the whole don't take a lot of responsibility for their part in where we are today either. And many lobbyists will routinely deny that there is any connection between campaign contributions and legislative action and earmarks. And if that were true, you'd have to really wonder why, for example, people on, say, the Defense Appropriations Committee gets so many campaign contributions from defense contractors and defense lobbyists, and why all those people aren't giving their money to, say, people on the Agriculture Committee. If there was really no connection, you wouldn't actually see the links between the money and the action. So I think everybody needs to be a little more honest about their role in creating the problem, and then more honest about what we could really do to solve it.
I would just make one comment, because it's something we haven't mentioned here today, but there's a whole class of activities that are every bit as insidious as what an evildoer lobbyist would engage in, like Jack Abramoff, that we haven't talked about today, and that's the professional establishment in and around Washington and outside the Beltway today that engages in grassroots, grass tops, and media advocacy. There's no difference between what I do in lobbying a member of Congress and what company X does in making sure that member of Congress gets 3,000 emails on a particular subject and that they get paid for that. And the fact that we're not calling that lobbying is just because those companies have been successful in Congress in keeping it from being lobbying at this point. So I would add that whole class of activities, and if you really want to be disgusted about how much money is being spent on this, that would actually triple the amount of money we're talking about in advocacy.
Yep, agree with that. I just would add, these comments, I think, indicate that this is a systemic problem. The money in politics issue is a systemic problem, and that's why so many people have succumbed to it. It's not that the individuals, except for the few bad actors, are really bad people. They're not. They're public servants. But I think that we have a system that's broken. And I would disagree with the. I'm not giving up on public financing at all. And Bob Edgar is as great a person as you'll find, who's now head of Common Cause, a former pastor, a current pastor, former congressman, and Common Cause and Public Campaign are pushing for this now, and I think this is the bigger solution. We've talked about tinkering around the edges. I think the downside is the funding that you all have identified that, could easily be spent. Well, taxpayer, why do you want to throw your money after these politicians who have been so downgraded? But I think in some of the states that have enacted public financing that they have found other mechanisms, and maybe there's a way, and that maybe corporations might, as much as they might not like that, might be the beneficiaries of this Supreme Court ruling might be the ones who would foot the bill. And in that case, I think the American public might look differently upon a democratically financed system. The last few comments are from my personal point of view. They're not something that Clippy or Clippy's board has ratified, but this is, my sense on where we need to go, and from, I think our comments indicate some of the broader changes that we need to look at.
Let me just add one quick thing.
Sure.
I was talking with somebody who's close to a congressman, and this is a brand new congressman that was coming in, and they were told that they need to spend 20% of their time fundraising. 20% of the time. You're talking about a fifth of their time not doing their job, which is legislating. That tells you where the system is.
I want to, Rich mentioned grassroots lobbying. I want to always make the distinction between paid
Correct.
grassroots lobbying and grassroots lobbying, which is an essential thing that nonprofits need to be able to do to advocate for their clients and clientele. I want to open the conversation up to the audience for questions. Please come to the mic, identify yourself, and state your question.
Jim Snyder from iSolent. I'd like to paraphrase Dave Wendholz's comment on lobbying regulation, that if it quacks like a duck, it should be regulated as a duck. I think all the panelists would agree, regardless of what they think about lobbying, that if two entities act like a lobbyist in the same way, they should be treated the same way under the law. And I also imagine that the panelists would agree that there probably are some exceptions, entities that act like lobbyists and aren't regulated. I have two questions related to entities that I think act like lobbyists that are not really properly treated as such. One relates to the Federal Advisory Committee system. There are about 1,000 Federal Advisory Committees and about 40,000 individuals that serve on those committees. And they're sort of sold to the public as experts and with diverse perspectives. That's the way they typically are sold, advisory committees. In practice, many of them are stakeholders, overwhelmingly dominated by registered lobbyists, and they are, in some sense, exempt. So if you're on a subcommittee, you have all these lobbyists in the room with the regulators. There's no disclosure on the subcommittees. If they went and lobbied directly, they'd be subject to ex parte rules. So we have all these lobbyists. Should anything be done to require more transparency in the FACA process? There's a lot of people arguing that it should be done. Should we begin to think of FACA more as a vehicle for lobbyists in this traditional way they've been publicly presented? The second one has to do with think tanks and lobbying. Think tanks are also another entity that are not traditionally thought of as lobbyists. Some think tanks separate their lobbying activities from their think tank activities. The Center for American Progress, Brahman, has two different divisions. They've got an action fund and they've got their think tank. And there's a number of other think tanks that do that. However, many of them don't. And we have a different standards for think tanks. Whereas lobbyists, as my understanding, are regulated by their individual behavior. If they reach a certain threshold, like 20%, they have to disclose it. But for think tanks, it's based on the total activity of the think tank, and there's a lower threshold. So what you have at a number of think tanks is you have basically full-time legislative or regulatory liaisons who are completely exempt from the laws, and they're not disclosed as such. So we have something like 1,000 think tanks in DC. It's big money, and you come from the Hill, you can go work for lobbyists, or often today you can go work directly for a think tank, and then you're not even subject to the revolving door restrictions and whatnot. Should think tanks be treated that act the same way at an individual level as lobbyists, be treated under the same regulatory regime? So those are the two exemptions.
I would, a couple of things. Just working, I'm doing a lot of work now on climate change and energy issues, and I work a lot with EPA regularly. My experience with, and for that matter, I'm on the National Research Council on the Board of Environmental Sciences and Toxicology, so and that's not a FACA, but it's very similar to a FACA. My experience with FACA is that it all hangs out there. Most of the meetings are public. The committees are all relatively well balanced. I don't mind trying to do something to make it more transparent, But I will tell you, it's already too cumbersome to use for a lot of issues. So I'll just use one example in my space. The U.S. Climate Action Partnership was run by Pew and others and convened outside of the government because FACA was too cumbersome in getting something set up. When I worked in the Clinton administration, I worked for Administrator Brown at EPA. I set up a FACA on Superfund reauthorization in 1993, and it took us 9 months to get the advisory committee set up and get it populated, when we only had that Congress really to get legislation through. So again, I just want to balance the public policy effectiveness and the purpose of the FACA against the need for disclosure and the need for transparency. But I'm fine with whatever else is needed in transparency, so long as we don't make the FACAs even less efficient than they already are.
Just a brief comment on that.
Sure.
EPA has a whole different culture regarding transparency than most federal agency. It's a culture of openness, and what you're describing is not my experience with other agencies that don't have that
And that may be
culture.
the case, and I pretty much am limited to EPA and DOE there. On the think tank stuff, boy, I will tell you, there are a couple elements. I want to mention think tanks, and there's something else that I forgot to mention before. There are think tanks here in town that are basically funded by wealthy individuals on the right and the left that are nothing more than, for-profit efforts masking and appearing to be nonprofit efforts. And, that is a game in town that needs to be addressed at some point. And I agree with you 100%. And I'm not just, I'm thinking right now of some elements on the right, but I'm sure there are elements on both sides of the aisle in that space. So I think that is something that needs to be addressed. My general reaction is, if you're up on the hill and you're walking around and you're advocating a policy position, if you're Mother Teresa, you need to register. I don't care. That's and I'm actually not a member of the League of Lobbyists, although yeah, I was going to say that's probably going to cost me at the end of the meeting. The other thing I want to mention is I would challenge everybody in this room to go back and look at the number of people who are now serving in this administration who deregistered in the year before the election, okay? And that means you knew what was coming, and you decided that it wasn't a good time to be a lobbyist right now. And the reason I mention that is I have a whole bunch of friends who were, it was suggested to, you ought to do this, and who just decided 6 to 9 months out, well, if we win, we won't go in, we'll just, we're going to stay out here and be lobbyists. And that's that sort of defeats the spirit, I think, of what is proclaimed to be the administration's policy in this space. That it's not just you were initiating waivers afterwards, but you were telling people in advance, hey, psst, come here, you may want to deregister now. And I forgot to mention that before, and it's not related to your question, but just wanted to throw that out there.
I think you kind of hit everything I was going to go after that. With the trade advisory committees, though, I think, I think you are going to lose a tremendous amount. And I think one of the problems about removing lobbyists from those advisory committees is you're taking away, and I have spoken to a number of organizations, small associations, where they have one person in Washington that does the government relations. And they serve as their lobbyist, and then they also serve as the person on the trade advisory. So what you're doing is the difference between the have and the have-nots get greater. The bigger associations or the corporations that can afford to send somebody down to Washington 4 times a year to sit in these committee meetings can do it. But your small little nonprofit or trade association can't do it. And once again, it's a demonization of the term lobbyist. A lobbyist is just a subject matter expert that can get that message across to those people. And yes, they may have a vested interest, but you know what? You can, what's wrong with having a conflict of interest or a disclosure or an increased, in any other, if you sit on a board of directors and you have a vested interest, you recuse yourself from that conversation. It's pretty simple to get around without banishing the entire class of people. And I'll tell you, if this had happened to the dentist or the lawyers or anybody else that's a definable class of people, there'd be an uproar. But because it happened to those evil lobbyists, it's accepted. and that's shameful.
Well, maybe not the dentists.
Right.
If I could just clarify one thing, normally they meet maybe 4 times a year, but in practice, as subcommittees where the real business is done, they meet over the phone, and they can
Which
meet
is worse,
many
because
times, and
Stick
there's
it-
no
stick it all
disclosure
up-
there.
Stick it all up on YouTube. I mean, aside from when I can't sleep, it will be helpful. You know, this is not hard to do today. Technology exists to make all this 100% transparent. Will it impact deliberations? Obviously it will. But that's okay. You know, if somebody is willing to go on camera and say, this is my position and this is what I think you ought to do, and it's accessible over the internet, I think that's a check and balance. That's a reasonable thing to do.
Just the major argument against that is it costs about $250 an hour for closed captioning for faculty meetings, and it's up to about $400 for transcripts and closed captioning. So even though the YouTube part is free, the other stuff makes it
I understand,
expensive.
but none of what we're talking about is free. Transparency costs money. Sometimes it clearly costs money in the instance you're talking about, but sometimes it's opportunity costs and other things. So that we're going to pay for this one way or another. I think we're paying for it right now in what's not happening up on Capitol Hill.
I'd like you to speculate on the impact of Citizens United case on lobbying in Washington and/or other actions the court may take that might influence political speech. And I have a particular interest about 501c3s.
Yeah.
Larry?
Yeah, well, I think it's an important decision that's really, I'm pleased is getting attention in the public and generally. And I think it sort of shows that, I know there's a lot of anger towards Washington, but I think that, when we've seen populism in our country, large business has been in the picture as well with, and I think, I personally believe the decision was wrongly decided. I think the corporations are not people, and therefore the extending of political rights to corporations is really a very recent phenomenon. It's like 50 years that even that concept started to come in, and the predominant history has been to regulate corporate involvement in elections, right? Starting back with Teddy Roosevelt and the prohibition on contributions. And so I think there's, there likely will be some grassroots. We talked about the solution needs to come outside from the grassroots, and I think there's the potential for that the decision could trigger folks to say, wait a second, who owns this government? And I think, money is just not a good way to set up our political system. It's just not a good way to decide who gets to run, who's considered a viable candidate, because money is not distributed equally in society. The voting system is one person, one vote. The financial, the way money works in society, it doesn't get distributed that way. So to use money as a determinant of who's viable or not doesn't work. But let me say this, in light of the decision, I think that first, the court did uphold the disclosure and disclaimer provisions, and that is really significant. I think it will present some very interesting and difficult issues for nonprofits because we have a tradition of wanting to keep our contributors anonymous and not those who want to be. And I think there will be legal issues that are raised around that. But I think that we have to remember that the First Amendment rights are not just of the speakers, but they're of the voters and of the citizens who the right to receive information to make to be able to be a self-governing people. And in the end, I think we have to feel that at least the top, the ability of voters to know who's funding political advertising, at least the top contributors to that. My guess is that will be held constitutional. And finally, I'd like to say on the grassroots side that I think the decision adds extra urgency and will spur a revisiting of the rules around charitable involvement, both in lobbying and in nonpartisan voter engagement activities, educating voters on the issues that particular charities care about. So I think that, and I've seen already, having talked about this, seen broad ideological support for this. We've, when we were looking at lobby simplification in 2005, we had Focus on the Family, we had Concerned Women for America, we had Alliance for Justice who's here, and we had, so we had, and then you had Goodwill and United Ways and YMCAs and sort of your service-oriented folks. So I think there's, from what I'm saying, a potentially broad agreement that even if people disagree over Citizens United, there would be agreement that we need to simplify and update the speech rights of charities and other nonprofits.
I was just going to, just a quick response, and I haven't seen this yet, so I'm just, because I have an overactive mind, giving you like worst case scenario. There's always a group in any election of 30 to 50 members who are on the most vulnerable list in the House. And if I were going to be thinking evil thoughts, I would be, from a lobbying perspective as a company, and I'm a contract lobbyist, so I don't work for one particular company, and I had a particular issue of concern, I would be thinking about those members and talking to those members about the importance of my position and implicitly laying the groundwork to say, and if this doesn't go the right way, you will see a commercial from me in your campaign that makes clear you shouldn't be voted for again. And I think that's the toxic nature of what the decision results in.
Except that I don't think it'll be the company will put up an ad by itself. I think it'll create a new organization
Correct.
to put up the ad because half its customers may like that particular politician. So I don't think they'll want to be associated with it so closely. So either they'll funnel the money to somebody else, like the Chamber of Commerce that's already existing, or perhaps now create their own organization that they have a little more control over to make that call for them.
Right.
To make
So,
that.
it just brings, and frankly, nothing has to be said, because in the back of the member, the members are all going to be briefed on your worst nightmare is X. And so they're going to walk into meetings, have these discussions, and that's what they're going to be, thinking about at the end of the day, which is not, again, how you want to be making public policy.
Other questions from the audience? Got time for one more, I believe.
I'm Gary Bass with OMB Watch. None of you have been overwhelmingly supportive of the administration's efforts to curb lobbyists and special interests. You're, I should say, supportive of the objective. You are critical of how it's been pursued. Yet, I've seen some things that were remarkable in the last year. Melanie, you're quite familiar with the White House visitor logs being made disclosed. The notion of people from industry who came in and were running the regulatory agencies are no longer being able to do that. The revolving door has been slammed, as much as slam can be. Gifts have been put into abeyance. There are a number of things that are, I think, in the right direction on curbing special influence. So I'm curious, if you move outside your hat of just the lobbyists, do you feel there's been progress? I also just think on the disclosure side, while disclosure, and I'm a huge fan of disclosure may also not help us really resolve the large, if not obscene amount of money that lobbyists like the Chamber of Commerce put into the game. And how do we address that problem? None of you, Melanie, you came the closest in describing some pieces in the legislative process that might change to address some of that. But will disclosure really change the practice? Notwithstanding, Rich, your point of giving disclosure at the on grassroots lobbying. So I open it up to hear your answers.
I would just say up front, while you're right, those things have been changed. They've all been changed administratively, and all of them will be changed back if Mitt Romney is president in 3 years. I can guarantee you that. So you know, none of it is permanent. We haven't changed the culture. We've changed for this administration. And I think that's the problem. The things the administration is doing that you've mentioned are all laudable and good, but they're not permanent. And I think you're right. I think the huge amount of money in the system to run campaigns and the engine in town directed to that to influence policy up on the Hill or in the White House is a difficult area because it's so closely hinged to speech to break. And it's probably beyond the scope of a program like this to go into detail, but I go back to what I started with up front, which is these are issues where there should be ongoing discussion between the lobbying community, a broad-based group of stakeholders who can sort of figure out what we need to be doing here. We're all not just lobbyists and public interest advocates. We also happen to be citizens, and folks ought to have an interest in that space of getting together to make continuous improvement, in the public policy making process and gaining more confidence in that process on the part of the public as we move forward.
I'd like to acknowledge and praise this president for. I think there is. He has brought a new tone, and outside of the lobbying side, on the transparency side, and the Freedom of Information Act. On that same first day that he did the executive order on ethics, he reversed a presumption that information from the government shouldn't be released to the public, and through Freedom of Information Act requests. And I think, I think and that I think is significant. I think less of obviously the aspects of the executive order that were predicated on the LDA and restricting people from public service. But I think the gift ban and some of the other aspects deserve our praise and are important. I think the problem, as Melanie said, is when you try to, and particularly if you contrast this, not wanting to be in a partisan way here, but we remember in the last administration with Dick Cheney and the energy in any number of ways, the public's desire to get information from its government was very difficult. But but I think the problem is that when you sell this as you've cleaned up Washington by passing an executive order on ethics and some of these things, it's not the public. Who in the public today would say that they've cleaned up Washington when you haven't dealt with the special interest money and on a range of issues, from healthcare to foreclosures to financial reform to cap and trade, whichever side of the issue you're on, you can't, I don't think the public buys that. So I think that's the problem.
And I think we're going to have to leave it there. We want to thank our panel, our distinguished panel, with a round of applause I believe they deserve. We're not going to resolve this issue totally today, but stay tuned to OMB Watch. Check us out at www.ombwatch.org. Thank you and good afternoon.
All right, thank you.